live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about another of my favorite episodes, which is Bread and Circuses. I really like this episode, but this is another episode, like the Omega Glory, that really stretches the credulity of parallel worlds theory. So in this episode, the Enterprise finds the wreckage of an earlier ship, and they sort of track it back to where it was destroyed because Spock's sensors don't pick up the bodies of any of the crew, so they're trying to sort of locate the crew. So they go to this planet, which is basically a 20th century Roman Empire. So they have televised gladiatorial games, they have cars named after the Roman gods, they have institutionalized slavery with health benefits and things like this. They have a Roman Senate, all these things. There is a kind of resistance/revolt going on among some of the slaves. Slaves who are followers of the Sun, the Sun's message being peace and universal brotherhood. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy fall in with a group of these slaves, and they learn that the captain of the previous ship, Captain Merrick, has become the first citizen, Merricus. So they have to try and get to Merrick and figure out what it is that's going on. There is another slave, Flavius Maximus, who was a former gladiator, who's now a follower of the Sun. He takes them part of the way into the city, but they get captured by police as fleeing slaves, and they're basically imprisoned. Kirk mentions that he knows the first citizen, and so, you've got a whole thing where they're trying to sort of negotiate with Merrick and figure out what's going on. Spock and McCoy get put into gladiatorial games to try and force Kirk to order down the rest of the Enterprise crew so that this world won't be contaminated by outside ideas or influences. Kirk obviously is quite reluctant to order the entire crew down to basically fight to death in gladiatorial games. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy make several escape attempts, etc., etc. Things occur. Eventually, Merrick steals a communicator and calls the Enterprise to beam Kirk, Spock, and McCoy up. Merrick is stabbed by the proconsul. And Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are beamed out. And that's sort of the end of it. There's no real resolution to the conflict of the plot. They're just sort of like, well, that was a fun adventure. Now we're off. But we get one last fun little tidbit, which is that Uhura has been monitoring the planet's communications, and Kirk, Spock, and McCoy couldn't really understand the sun worshippers. First off, because Rome didn't really have sun worshippers. It wasn't a thing that really existed by the time you get to the Roman Empire, the Roman imperial period, but also because sun worship does not tend to have a philosophy of peace or fraternity. Those don't tend to be beliefs of sun worshippers. Uhura informs them that it's not the sun, S-U-N, it's the Son, S-O-N. It's the Son of God. And Kirk sort of concludes, Caesar and Jesus, they had them both. Which, of course, makes some sense, I suppose. It's a kind of weird twist. So first off, this is one of the very few overt discussions of religion in all of the original series, largely because Gene Roddenberry believed that by the time of Star Trek, by the time that this is set, religion would largely have died out. It would no longer be something that people were particularly concerned about. So the whole Christianity as a sort of force for good, for love, for universal compassion, etc., is a divergence from the typically atheistic world of Star Trek. It's a weird bit because parallel worlds theory here again sort of allows for the idea that an empire like the Roman Empire could evolve on a different planet, but the idea that it would be exactly like the Roman Empire from Earth, having both Caesar and Jesus, kind of doesn't make that much sense. So again, this is one of those things like the Omega Glory where there's too many things that are the same. The fact that the product, because Spock looks through a magazine when they're in the slaves' hideout cave, and it's like, these are products named after Jupiter, after Mars, after Venus, etc. The real gods of Rome on Earth. It doesn't make sense that the gods would have the same names on this parallel planet. Even if you had gods serving similar functions, it doesn't make sense that they would have the same names. But at one point, McCoy claims that it's illogical that a 20th century Roman Empire would have sun worshippers because that is not parallel to Rome on Earth. And this is the thing he takes issue with. But these Romans speak colloquial 20th century American English, which they point out. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy point out that these people are speaking colloquial 20th century American English. Why? Why would that happen? That is in fact the only non-parallel thing in this world. Because in order to have colloquial 20th century American English, you need a series of things to happen. 1, the Roman Empire needs to fall. 2, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes need to conquer Britain. 3, the Normans need to conquer Britain. 4, you need to have various other influences, Scandinavian, Irish, Celtic, all these different influences that give us contemporary English. Then you need to have a U.S. You need to have an America, a North American country along the lines of the U.S. or maybe Canada, where that language changes. Now, I get why they do this. I get why virtually every alien species that the Enterprise crew comes across speaks English. It's because the viewer speaks English. The viewer speaks with an American accent in 1968. I get that. Don't draw attention to it, though. So there's that element. That's not really social justice stuff, though, to be fair. That's just a kind of problem with, again, this use of parallel worlds theory to allow for things that don't really make sense because they're cheaper, because they're easier for the audience to digest, etc., etc. So, some of the big social justice elements here. One, obviously, is the use of slaves in gladiatorial games. This was a very, very significant component of Roman culture, as most people know. Rome loved gladiatorial games, naval combat, mock simulations. They loved fights between humans, gladiators, and exotic animals. They loved actual gory executions in their tragic drama, etc., etc. The Romans liked violent entertainment. That's just part of how it was. And slavery was a major component of life in the Roman Empire, as it was throughout much of the ancient world. To maintain these things into the 20th century is actually not that unfeasible. I mean, while today in countries like the US we don't have gladiatorial games, we do have things like mixed martial arts, MMA fights, we have ultimate fighting championships, things like this. We have, I mean, boxing is a little bit more protected, professional wrestling is a little bit more protected, but we do have entertainment in which people fight and can significantly injure one another. We also love horror movies, we love war movies, we love action movies in which people fight one another and in which people die. Now, of course, those things are fake, and we know that those things are fake, but we nonetheless enjoy that as forms of entertainment. And so the question, I think, of, and also football, I would put American football in this same kind of category. We know, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the concussions sustained by football players have long-term negative impacts on them. We know that football players are more likely to be African American, they're more likely to be from working class families, and so they are, in some sense, seen by society as disposable, and so, to a certain extent, society kind of says, we don't necessarily care if there are long-term negative impacts on this group of people's health. And that's extremely problematic. So there is definitely a difference between gladiatorial combat and the kinds of things that we enjoy for entertainment today. But to some extent, these are differences of degree rather than kind. And that raises interesting problems when we go to, for instance, condemn the Roman Empire for gladiatorial combat, and even for slavery. I mean, slavery does still exist in the modern world. It's much less prevalent and it's much less central in most societies, but it does still exist. But even without slavery, there is a Marxist argument that having to work, having to do labor that produces value largely for someone else is akin to slavery. Again, a difference of degree rather than kind, although that's more of a debatable point, I think. But these sort of ideas of how does a society run and what's the role of violence, what's the role of personal liberty within that society, they are still very much pressing questions.